First, some more logistics. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have iClickers? Let's see how many people have iClickers. Let's start clicking away. A for yes, B for no, C for maybe. We were at 44 iClickers last time. There are 155 seats in the auditorium, but I don't think the class will stay at that. They'll stay all that large. Even though we appear to be at 125, 130 right now. 85 out of 130 is not bad. Okay, maybe, all right. The maybes are definitely cautious. I won't claim that there's a right answer on this one since I'm amused. But a little sounding of where people are. Are you currently enrolled in this class, or are you on the wait list? And if you're on the wait list, or if you are enrolled, are you going to drop either your spot on the class or your spot on the wait list? I'd like to know, if only so I can figure out exactly how worried we should be about the absence of spots in this particular class. And 10, 9, 8, 7... Of course, people on the wait list are probably not people who have bought iClickers yet unless they need them for another course, so this isn't the best of all possible questions. Oh, wow. Nobody wants to drop. That's interesting. Everyone here is going to show up again next Tuesday. That's good. All right, that's not quite. I was hoping to say there'd be a couple of drops, and so we wouldn't have any problems at all, because as of 9 a.m. this morning, the course plus waitlist was at 163 people, and we have 155 slots. But given that I think we now have only 140 people here, it's plain that unless a bunch of people who are not here want to take this course and are higher on you than the waitlist, then I can be confident. In fact, I can be highly confident that everyone here in this room who wants to get in will. Of course, something could still go wrong. Something always goes wrong. As former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says, there are the things you know, and the things you know that you don't know. Where you get into real trouble are the things you know but you don't know that you know them, and the things that you don't know where you don't know that you don't know them. There's always that around, and I can't imagine what it would be. But barring that happening, everyone here should be in off the waitlist, registered in the course by early next week. Problem set 1, we have our problem set 1 now up now up on the website for the course. It's due on Thursday, January 27th at the start of lecture. It's a combination scavenger hunt through internet data and listen to lecture problem set. Other problem sets will involve model building and computation. This one doesn't. This one is a warm-up. Read the assigned chapters in the textbook, look at the inside covers of the textbook, listen to lectures, browse around the Federal Reserve Economic Data website, looking for keywords like hires and fires and job openings and labor turnover, and also browse the very interesting Gapminder World website, which has a bunch of absolutely marvelous statistics with respect to global development over the past 2 centuries. Do all that, and you should be absolutely fine with problem set 1. Problem set 1 has 20 questions. This is what they look like. They're, I think, at least relatively easy, to solve. A few more logistical questions as I try to figure out who you are and what you know. The first question is, when and where did you all take Econ 1? You all are supposed to have taken Econ 1, or at least placed out of Econ 1 by having a high AP test score in the past. I'd like to know where and when, so I can have a sense of what your Econ 1 experience was like, because different Econ 1 courses can be quite different in terms of what you learn, what they teach you. And what do we get? Before last semester here at Berkeley. In high school as an AP course, very few, 20% at some other university. That's interesting. I'd expect that to be 10% given our transfer student. And of course, let me apologize to the 4 of you who took Econ 1 from me here last semester and who learned nothing at all during it. I'll try to do better the next time I teach it. Okay, but that's helpful. And also, what are your politics, if I may ask? Anonymously, that is. There are no right answers for this. I ask because, as German sociologist of a century ago, Max Weber, said in a famous speech he gave on education and scholarship as a vocation, the most important task for any teacher is to take the students that he or she has and to make sure that they see and register those facts that are inconvenient for their particular political point of view. Good. A bunch of Republicans. I can be fairly nonpartisan and balanced here. Okay, yes. Okay, we'll do a recount. We'll see if the machine is behaving better this time. Oh dear, this may have to switch. They may be asking an iClicker question in the calculus class next door, which is enormous. We'll see. We'll resolve this. We may have to switch our channel. It's nice that I can be nonpartisan rather than spending all my time pointing out to the Democrats like me the unpleasant things about the world that don't correspond to their vision of it, but instead can be relatively balanced. I will try to do so. And last question, recall from last lecture, about how much bigger is total world GDP? That is, income per capita times the number of people that we have in the world than it was back 10,000 years ago. What do you think the answer is? And the answer you give doesn't have to give the answer that I gave in the last lecture. This isn't really a right answer type of question here, when there are right answer type of questions. I will tell you what they are. Okay, we're evenly spread out among A, B, and C, with a bunch of people saying D, and very few people saying E. And I would actually take either of B, D, and E as a good answer. As for E, let's take the least popular one. That you can't really make comparisons of standards of living across such an enormous span as, say, the year 0 and today, because everyone's tastes and preferences are different. Everyone's different. We today are very different people than our ancestors were back 2,500 years ago. Activities that we like to do, like playing Halo, say, or watching Grey's Anatomy are things that they would find absolutely bizarre and uninteresting and unimportant. By contrast, things that they did, worshiping, say, the god Jupiter, the things that they got enormous amounts of satisfaction from, we think of as particularly silly and strange. You can make that point. I think it's probably wrong. I think there's a good deal more of what humans like and of human commonality than that. Right? We all want enough food not to be hungry, enough clothing not to be cold, enough shelter not to be wet. We want to find people to love and to love us during our lifetime, and we want to be amused. Do all those things, and we tend to be pretty happy. Economies are ways of trying to assemble the resources to do these things, and we can, I think, fairly well classify whether an economy is doing well or badly. D, as I say, D, that such comparisons are very hard to make. That back when my great-grandfather was teaching at Washington University in St. Louis, he got to go to Cambridge, Massachusetts once and only once a year. And then his brother would get him into the big Widener Library there with its 6 million volumes. And he could do real research because Widener had 10 times the library of Washington University in St. Louis, and he could do a whole bunch more of his work there and read lots of things he could never see otherwise. It was a really big deal. It involved a 3-day train trip there and back, something that took immense amounts of resources and was terribly valuable to him. By contrast, for me here today, there may be one thing in 25 I want to look at that's in Widener Library and a couple other places and no place else and not here at Berkeley, but I can get it through interlibrary loan in a week and a half, and I do. And as for a 2 or 3 day train trip across the country no, we simply fly there in 5 hours. And I always fly there overnight because it seems a waste of time to fly all day and then not sleep the following night. Because I'm not going to sleep well when I get to the East Coast because of jet lag, I might as well not sleep well on the plane. And it's something that was a very big deal then, not a big deal to me at all. It's unclear how to measure the changes in our life capacities and in our life statuses, given that we have access to a lot of powers and capabilities that they did not. You tell someone 2,000 years ago that even working class people would be able to afford to fly across 3,000 miles a couple times a year in 5 hours, and they would say, wow, that society must be so extraordinarily rich, everyone must be ecstatically happy all the time. And yet we're not. We're not ecstatically happy. We might be pretty happy. We're not ecstatically so. There's an argument within economics as to whether rich countries are happier or are much happier than poor ones are. So I think D's an argument you can make. For the others, I think there's definitely a right answer. That is, we think that about 10,000 years ago, there were somewhere between 5 and 10 million people in the world. That's about all that the world can support, with humans pursuing a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Right? Gathering edible plants is a fairly labor-intensive process. Hunting large animals is a dangerous process. Hunting small animals is an annoying process. We don't see the ability of us with stone tools being able to support more than 5 or 10 million people on the planet until we actually start planting our own plants where we want them to be and then guarding them from the squirrels and the birds, and until we actually take the cow and the sheep and the goat and we domesticate them so that they come to us when we call. Do that, and you can support marvelous human populations. And indeed, we now have almost 7 million people rather than 5 million. 7 billion people rather than 5 million. That itself is a multiple of 1,000 in total world GDP. Add to it the fact that we think that we are 15 times richer, at least in a GDP production sense, than our predecessors were 10,000 years ago. That gets you to the 17,000 times number. About 14 times bigger is a good answer to the question of how much richer are we as individuals than our predecessors were 10,000 years ago, looking across the planet as a whole. About 1,200 times bigger is probably the answer to how much bigger is the human population than it was 10,000 years ago. But you multiply them together, you get total economic production. You really want the number of 17,000 to keep in your head. That's what you should say. So there, I've already burned up half an hour on logistics and throat clearing. That's not great with respect to my finishing the whole syllabus I planned out by early April so that then we can do additional topics. We'll see how it goes. Measuring the macroeconomy. We want to have a whole bunch of measures of how the economy as a whole is doing. What are they? How do we construct them? And once again, I'd like to know how much you know. How much national income accounting did you do in your Econ 1 class? When Christy Romer, for example, teaches Econ 1 here at Berkeley, she skips national income accounting entirely because it's boring. When Marty Olney teaches it, she spends a bunch of time on national income accounting because she thinks it's important. And if you kind of don't really know what you're measuring, you don't have any chance of understanding what the numbers mean when they announce on the television that GDP is 14.2 trillion, or whatever they say. And once again, let's try that again. I think we have to talk to the math class. No, it's considerably better. All right, so even if a bunch of these are coming in from the math class next door, we still have a large plurality about how we barely did any. Okay, that's expected. That means I should actually spend some time talking about what the aggregate numbers in the economy that are worth paying a lot of attention to now. Right now, I happen to think that there are 6 kind of aggregate numbers on the economy that are worth paying a lot of attention to. The first is GDP, real GDP, gross domestic product adjusted for inflation, and also its dependent statistics, gross domestic product per worker and gross domestic product per capita. GDP divided by the population, GDP per capita, kind of tells us how rich a society is in terms of how much is the value of goods and services that are being produced. GDP per worker tells us how productive the average worker is, and GDP total tells us what the total value of marketed final goods and services produced in the country is in some particular time, usually a year. GDP is almost always measured as so-and-so dollars of such and such purchasing power each year. So the first statistic is GDP. The second is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is useful mostly as a measure of slack and waste and bad performance in the economy. When the unemployment rate is higher than its normal good times level of 5% or so, it's a sign that something's going wrong, and that a lot of stuff that could be being produced and sold in the country isn't, because something's gone wrong with the economic mechanism. There's also inflation and the price level. Inflation being the rate of change of the overall price level, the price level being some kind of average of the dollar prices at which goods and services are being sold in the country. Inflation is interesting because it's a measure of how well the economy is enabling rational calculation. If an economy is undergoing high or even moderate inflation, then people don't really understand what prices mean in terms of scarcities. They don't know what to compare prices to. And so it's hard to make rational decisions about either production or consumption. If someone quotes you a price of $15 for a particular good, and you don't really know what that means because prices have been changing, drifting upward almost always, for some substantial period of time at some substantial rate. Then there are three financial market measures that are worth looking at. The first is the stock market, largely because it's a measure of business confidence. You want to know whether businesses and investors have confidence in the future, look at what the stock market is doing. Second are interest rates on short-term government bonds. They're a measure of the scarcity or the ampleness of liquidity in the economy, of whether there's enough purchasing power, enough liquid cash in the hands of individuals for people to easily buy what they think they want to buy, and thus for people to sell what they want to sell. An economy in which short-term government bond interest rates are very high is likely to be an economy that's very short of liquid cash, and so a whole bunch of transactions that people would like to make, they can't. They're short of cash, and so something's likely to be going wrong. Third are long-term interest rates, real interest rates on long-term corporate bonds, and that's a measure of business access to capital. Can businesses that think they have productive opportunities to expand and make more actually find the financing allowing them to build more factories and install more machine tools? Those are the 6 sets of economic statistics that you should pay most attention to in macro. And now we're going to talk about GDP. GDP as a concept was designed by one of my teachers, Simon Kuznets, an economist, American economist back in the 1930s. He noted that nobody really had a very good idea of how large and productive the economy was. And so he began to think about what statistic can I easily estimate pretty much all by myself with the data that we have available. And he came up with gross domestic product. He said what we want to know is how much useful stuff is being produced in the economy and how many useful services are being provided by people in the economy. And we're going to divide those services into 4 categories, each of which we can measure pretty well. The first is consumption spending by households. What kinds of things, goods and services are households buying for their own use? Whether it's a washing machine or a standing rib roast or some, a dish of tofu surprise or whatever, a yoga lesson, what are households buying that they think is useful for themselves? The second is what are businesses doing to expand their productive capacity? What are businesses doing to increase the amount of goods that they are able to produce in the future? And we want to add investment spending to consumption spending. We don't just want to measure consumption spending because we'd say a society in which consumption spending is low but investment is high because people are taking a lot of care for the future and want to become richer in the future. We wouldn't say that that economy is poorer than one that had higher consumption and no savings and investment. Then, in addition, there's a government. And the government does lots of very useful things that make our lives easier. Certainly, right now, the government is rebuilding the Bay Bridge between here and San Francisco because the eastern span of the old Bay Bridge was sufficiently damaged by the Loma Prieta earthquake that there's a good chance that if there's another similar earthquake, it will fall down. And we'd rather not have that happen than be cut off from San Francisco, except through a bar to the Transbay Tube, which is also vulnerable to the next earthquake. We'd rather have a bridge so that we can get to San Francisco and back. Now, we could survive without such a bridge. When my grandfather lived in San Francisco in the early 1920s for one summer, when he was in college, he was an intern at an investment bank down in the financial district. He said he lived down by the Berkeley Marina and took the ferry across and back every day, and it was absolutely wonderful. You'd cruise about on the bay in your ferry, you'd watch the birds, you'd watch the sea lions. Either way, you'd arrive feeling refreshed and in touch with the great natural beauty of the San Francisco Bay Area, as opposed to the rather draggy experience of driving across a bridge and getting stuck for 15 minutes breathing gasoline fumes when the traffic backs up as you come down the span of the suspension bridge part. Nevertheless, we think the Bay Bridge is useful. The government is purchasing it for us. If we don't include government purchases in GDP, we don't get that amount of economic activity in our measure at all. Last is net exports. We're interested in how much we produce. We're interested in how productive the economy is. And they can have a case in which an economy is running a large trade surplus, in which it's producing more than it's consuming, and as a result it's exporting an awful lot of goods and services, and so piling up assets abroad as foreigners owe us money back. We want to say that that economy is highly productive and prosperous. By contrast, an economy like the U.S. today that is consuming more than it's producing, that's importing a lot of stuff and not exporting as much, and that is running itself into debt to foreigners and people in foreign countries, for that economy, it's actually less productive and prosperous than simply adding up consumption spending, investment spending, and government purchases would tell us. So we want to add net exports, if exports are greater than imports, or subtract net imports, when imports are greater than exports, as they are now in the United States, in order to get our total measure of GDP. And notice in all of this, we count final goods, right, not intermediate goods. We're not terribly interested if a business buys something from another business and then the business uses what it bought in order to make something that it then sells to consumers. Because a business isn't a person with a mind. A business is just a nexus of contracts. That a business has managed to buy something, well, that's nice, but that doesn't affect any sense of our final utility or how rich we are. What we want to know is we want to know what final demanders are buying. And that's consumers on the one hand, the government to the extent that it buys things that are useful to us on the other, net exports on the third, and then businesses to the extent that they are buying to expand their capacity, not the extent that they are simply buying in order to conduct their normal operations. That's what it is, a gross domestic product, the total value of final goods produced in the United States, divided into 4 categories: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. Simon Kuznets and company built up this concept in the 1930s, and it's been a very useful one. It's relatively easy to calculate. Unfortunately, it's not a very good one. The GDP is not a terribly good measure of economic welfare. And so I've given you 5 choices as to why it isn't a very good measure of economic welfare. The first is that it doesn't incorporate envy and spite relative income effects.